Washington, D.C. was buzzing with tension that you could almost feel in the air. The city that never sleeps was working overtime, and everyone knew something big was about to happen. Political reporters were running around with their phones glued to their ears, trying to get the inside scoop on what was really going down behind those closed doors. Representative Jasmine Crockett had been making waves lately. She was one of those politicians who never held back when it came to speaking her mind. Whether she was on television or posting on social media, Crockett always had something sharp to say about the previous administration. She particularly loved going after anything that had to do with national security decisions and how law enforcement was being handled. Then there was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who everyone just called AOC. She was like a political lightning rod. Wherever she went, controversy and attention followed. AOC had built her entire brand on being the voice of the people, the one who would call out corruption and stand up to powerful interests. Her Twitter account was legendary for how quickly she could fire back at anyone who crossed her path. Both of these women had something in common. They had been absolutely relentless in their criticism of how things were run during the Trump years. Every chance they got, they would talk about how terrible the surveillance programs were, how unfair the intelligence operations had become, and how the American people deserved better transparency from their government. But here's where things get interesting. While Crockett and AOC were busy making headlines with their public statements, there was someone else who had been quietly watching everything unfold. His name was Kash Patel, and he knew things that could make a lot of people very uncomfortable. Patel wasn't your typical Washington insider. He had worked in some pretty high-level positions during the previous administration, including roles at the Pentagon that gave him access to information most people never even knew existed. The guy had been in rooms where decisions were made that affected millions of Americans, and he had seen things that would probably shock the average person. What made Patel different from other former officials was that he wasn't afraid to talk. While most people who leave government jobs tend to stay quiet and write boring books years later, Patel was actively going on television shows and radio programs. He was telling people what really happened behind the scenes, and he wasn't sugarcoating anything. Conservative media loved having Patel on their shows because he could speak with authority about topics that other guests could only speculate about. He had the receipts, as they say. When he talked about intelligence operations or national security decisions, he wasn't just giving his opinion. He was sharing details from meetings he had actually attended. Democratic strategists were starting to get nervous about Patel's media tour. They could see that he was gaining influence and that people were listening to what he had to say. More importantly, they suspected that he might know things that could be embarrassing for some of their biggest stars. The problem was that Washington runs on secrets. Everyone knows things they're not supposed to talk about, and everyone has information that could damage their political enemies if it ever came to light. It's like a giant game of chess where nobody wants to make the first move because they're afraid of what their opponent might do in response. Intelligence sources, those mysterious people who always seem to know what's happening before anyone else, were whispering that Patel had detailed knowledge about classified operations. These weren't just any operations either. These were the kind of programs that politicians love to criticize in public, while secretly supporting them in private. The word around town was that some of the loudest critics of surveillance and intelligence gathering had actually been briefed on these very programs years earlier. Not only had they been told about what was happening, but they had been given the chance to object or raise concerns. Instead, many of them had simply nodded along and signed off on the very activities they would later condemn on television. This kind of hypocrisy is like political dynamite. American voters hate nothing more than politicians who say one thing in public and do something completely different in private. If Patel really did have proof that some of these critics had been in the loop all along, it could destroy careers and change the entire political landscape. The timing couldn't have been worse for Democrats. They were already dealing with multiple investigations and hearings that were keeping them busy, trying to manage their public image. The last thing they needed was someone with inside knowledge making them look like hypocrites on national television. Behind the scenes, phone calls were being made and meetings were being scheduled. Political operatives were trying to figure out exactly what Patel knew and how much damage he could potentially cause. Some were suggesting that they should try to discredit him before he could do any real harm, while others thought it might be better to just stay quiet and hope he would go away. But Patel wasn't going away. In fact, he was becoming more visible and more vocal with each passing day. His appearances on television were getting more attention, and his social media following was growing rapidly. People were starting to trust him as a source of information about what really happened during those controversial years. The really scary part for Democratic leadership was that Patel seemed to have documentation to back up his claims. He wasn't just making vague accusations or sharing gossip. When he talked about specific meetings or decisions, he could provide dates, locations, and even reference official documents that supported his version of events. Political insiders began to realize that this wasn't just another former official trying to get attention or sell books. Patel appeared to have a systematic understanding of how various intelligence programs worked and who had been involved in approving them. He knew which politicians had been briefed when those briefings had taken place, and what kind of information had been shared. The stage was being set for a confrontation that nobody really wanted, but everyone could see coming. On one side, you had popular Democratic representatives who had built their careers on being tough critics of government overreach. On the other side, you had a former insider who claimed to have evidence that these same critics had been secretly supportive of the very programs they publicly opposed. Major television networks were starting to take notice of the growing tension. Producers were reaching out to Patel's representatives, hoping to book him for interviews that could generate big ratings. They could sense that something explosive was about to happen, and they wanted to be the ones to capture it on camera. Tatintir, anticipation was building throughout Washington as people waited to see what would happen next. Would Patel continue to drop hints and make vague references to classified information, or would he eventually decide to lay all his cards on the table? And if he did decide to go public with everything he knew, how would the politicians he was targeting respond? Nobody could have predicted just how dramatic things were about to become when Patel finally got his chance to speak directly to the American people on live television. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the whole country was about to witness a political moment that would change everything. The morning started like any other day in the world of political television. Studio lights were being adjusted, makeup artists were putting finishing touches on guests, and producers were going through their final checks before going live. Nobody in that television studio had any idea they were about to witness one of the most shocking moments in recent political history. Kash Patel walked into the studio looking calm and confident. He had done hundreds of interviews before, so the bright lights and cameras didn't make him nervous. The host welcomed him with the usual pleasantries, expecting what they thought would be a routine discussion about current political events and maybe some behind-the-scenes stories from his time in government. The interview started exactly as everyone expected. They talked about general political topics, discussed some recent news stories, and Patel shared a few insights about how government really works. The host was pleased with how smoothly everything was going, and the production team was getting ready to wrap up what seemed like a perfectly normal segment. But then something changed in Patel's demeanor. He looked directly into the camera with a seriousness that immediately caught everyone's attention. The casual, conversational tone that had characterized the first part of the interview was suddenly replaced by something much more intense and purposeful. What happened next would be replayed on news channels for days and shared millions of times across social media platforms. Patel began speaking with the kind of precision and authority that only comes from someone who has first-hand knowledge of what they're discussing. Every word was carefully chosen, every detail was specific, and every claim was backed up with references to documented facts. He started by talking about intelligence operations that had been conducted during previous years. These weren't vague references to general government activities. These were specific programs with names, dates, and detailed descriptions of how they worked. Patel explained how certain surveillance activities had been approved and implemented, giving viewers a behind-the-scenes look at operations most people never knew existed. The really shocking part came when Patel began discussing who had been briefed on these programs. He talked about classified meetings that had taken place in secure government facilities, meetings where elected officials had been given detailed information about controversial intelligence activities. These weren't casual conversations or informal briefings. These were official sessions where representatives had been shown documents, given presentations, and asked to provide their input on ongoing operations. What made this revelation so explosive was the identity of some of the people who had attended these briefings. Patel mentioned that several prominent Democratic representatives, people who had spent years publicly criticizing these exact types of programs, had actually been present at meetings where the programs were discussed and approved. The host of the show was visibly stunned. They had expected a routine political interview, not a bombshell revelation that could potentially end careers and reshape public understanding of recent political history. The producer in the control room was frantically trying to decide whether to continue the interview or cut to commercial, but the moment was too significant to interrupt. Patel continued speaking with the same calm, methodical approach. He referenced specific meeting dates, mentioned particular briefing rooms, and even cited document numbers that could potentially be verified by investigative journalists. This wasn't someone making wild accusations or sharing gossip. This was a former government insider providing detailed, specific information about classified activities. The most damaging part of Patel's revelation was his description of how these representatives had reacted during the briefings. According to his account, not only had they been told about controversial surveillance programs, but they had actually supported them during the meetings. Some had asked questions about expanding the programs, others had suggested ways to make them more effective, and none had raised the kind of objections they would later voice in public. Social media began exploding before the interview was even finished. Viewers who were watching live started posting clips and quotes, and within minutes hashtags related to Patel's revelations were trending across multiple platforms. People were sharing their shock and disbelief, while others were demanding answers from the politicians mentioned in his account. The timing of these revelations was particularly devastating for the Democrats involved. These were representatives who had built their entire political brands around being tough critics of government, surveillance, and intelligence overreach. They had written op-eds condemning these exact types of programs, given speeches about protecting civil liberties, and used their opposition to surveillance as a way to rally their political base. News outlets across the political spectrum immediately began trying to verify Patel's claims. Investigative reporters started making phone calls to former government officials, trying to find other sources who could confirm or deny the details he had shared. The pressure was mounting for the politicians mentioned in his account to provide their own response to these serious allegations. What made the situation even more complicated was that much of what Patel discussed involved classified information. This meant that the representatives who had allegedly been briefed on these programs couldn't simply release documents or provide detailed rebuttals without potentially breaking secrecy laws themselves. They were essentially trapped in a situation where they couldn't fully defend themselves without admitting to having knowledge they had previously denied. The political implications were staggering. If Patel's account was accurate, it meant that some of the most vocal critics of government surveillance had actually been supportive of these programs when they thought nobody was watching. This kind of hypocrisy could destroy political careers and fundamentally change how voters viewed these representatives. Conservative media personalities were having a field day with the revelations. They saw this as vindication of their long-held belief that many Democratic politicians were hypocrites who said one thing in public and did something completely different in private. Liberal commentators, on the other hand, were trying to find ways to discredit Patel or minimize the significance of his claims. The really uncomfortable truth for many politicians was that Patel seemed to have receipts for everything he was saying. He wasn't making vague accusations that could be easily dismissed. He was providing specific details that suggested he had access to official records and documentation. This made it much harder for his targets to simply deny his claims or dismiss them as partisan attacks. Political strategists on both sides immediately recognized the significance of what had just happened. This wasn't just another political controversy that would fade away in a few news cycles. This was the kind of revelation that could reshape entire political careers and change how the public viewed certain politicians. The interview continued for several more minutes, with Patel providing additional details and context for his revelations. He spoke about the culture of secrecy in Washington, the way classified briefings were conducted, and the disconnect between what politicians said in public and how they behaved in private meetings. By the time the interview ended, the political world had been turned upside down. Phone lines at news organizations were ringing constantly as reporters tried to get reactions from the politicians mentioned in Patel's account. Congressional offices were being flooded with calls from constituents demanding explanations, and political operatives were working frantically to develop damage control strategies. The most telling aspect of the immediate aftermath was how quiet some of the biggest names in Democratic politics suddenly became. Representatives who were usually quick to respond to any criticism or controversy were notably silent in the hours following Patel's television appearance. This silence spoke volumes and only served to make his revelations seem more credible. As the news of Patel's bombshell interview spread across the country, it became clear that American politics had just experienced one of those rare moments that changes everything. The careful balance of public positions and private knowledge that had allowed certain politicians to maintain their credibility was suddenly in jeopardy, and the fallout was just beginning. The moment Kash Patel finished speaking on live television, phones started ringing all across Washington, D.C. It was like someone had just dropped a political bomb, and the shockwaves were hitting everyone at the same time. Congressional offices, that were usually busy but manageable, suddenly turned into complete chaos as staff members tried to figure out how to handle what had just happened. Representative Jasmine Crockett was in her office when her chief of staff burst through the door, with a look of pure panic on his face. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. He just started talking rapidly about Patel's interview and how social media was already going crazy with clips and commentary. Crockett's first reaction was disbelief. She couldn't believe that someone would actually go on television and make such specific claims about classified briefings. But as her staff showed her the clips and explained exactly what Patel had said, the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just another political attack or some vague accusation that could be easily brushed off. Patel had mentioned specific meetings, referenced particular dates, and even described details about briefing rooms that only someone who had actually been there would know. Crockett's communications team immediately went into crisis mode. They started making phone calls to other Democratic offices to see if anyone else was dealing with similar problems. What they discovered was that several other representatives were in exactly the same situation, all of them mentioned in Patel's interview, all of them facing questions about their participation in classified briefings they had never publicly acknowledged. The really frustrating part for Crockett was that she couldn't simply tell the truth about what had happened in those meetings. Everything Patel had discussed involved classified information, which meant that even confirming or denying his basic facts could potentially get her in legal trouble. She was essentially trapped in a situation where she couldn't defend herself without admitting to things she had spent years publicly opposing. Her staff started working on a response, but every draft they came up with had serious problems. If they denied Patel's claims too strongly, they risked being proven wrong if documentation ever became public. If they admitted to attending the briefings, they would have to explain why they had never mentioned this before and how they could justify supporting programs they had publicly criticized. Meanwhile, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was facing an even more intense situation. AOC had built her entire political career on being authentic and transparent with her followers. She was famous for her rapid-fire social media responses and her willingness to engage with any controversy head-on. But now, for the first time in years, she was completely silent. Her Twitter account, which usually posted multiple times per hour, hadn't been updated since before Patel's interview aired. Her Instagram stories were frozen, and her usual stream of responses to political events had completely stopped. This silence was so unusual that it actually became a story in itself, with political reporters noting how strange it was for AOC to go quiet during such a major controversy. Behind the scenes, AOC's team was in complete meltdown mode. Her senior advisors were having heated discussions about how to respond to Patel's specific claims about her participation in intelligence briefings. Some wanted her to go on the offensive and attack Patel's credibility, while others thought it would be better to acknowledge the briefings, but explain them in a way that didn't make her look hypocritical. The problem was that AOC had been particularly vocal about her opposition to surveillance programs. She had written detailed social media posts about protecting civil liberties, given speeches about government overreach, and even introduced legislation designed to limit intelligence gathering activities. If Patel's claims were true, it would mean she had been publicly opposing programs she had privately supported, or at least failed to object to. Her communications director was fielding calls from reporters every few minutes, all asking the same basic question. Had AOC attended the briefings Patel described, and if so, why had she never mentioned them before? The standard political response of deflecting or changing the subject wasn't going to work, because Patel's claims were too specific and too well documented. What made the situation even worse was that other sources were starting to come forward. Former government officials who had attended some of the same briefings were beginning to confirm basic details of Patel's account. They weren't necessarily agreeing with his interpretation of events, but they were verifying that the meetings had taken place and that certain representatives had indeed been present. Both Crockett and AOC found themselves in the uncomfortable position of watching their carefully crafted public images crumble in real time. Political opponents were already preparing statements that would highlight the apparent hypocrisy, while their own supporters were expressing confusion and disappointment on social media platforms. The really damaging part wasn't just that they had attended classified briefings. Lots of politicians do that as part of their oversight responsibilities. The problem was that they had never acknowledged these briefings publicly, and they had continued to criticize programs they had apparently been informed about and had the opportunity to object to during official government meetings. Republican politicians were having a field day with the revelations. They saw this as perfect evidence of Democratic hypocrisy and were already planning how to use this information in future campaigns and political debates. Conservative media outlets were running wall-to-wall coverage of Patel's interview, bringing on expert guests to explain the significance of what he had revealed. The panic wasn't limited to just the representatives mentioned in Patel's interview. Other Democratic politicians who had taken similar public positions were worried that they might be next. If Patel had detailed knowledge about these particular briefings, what other information might he have access to? Were there other meetings or documents that could implicate additional members of Congress? Party leadership was trying to coordinate a response, but they were struggling with the same basic problem that individual representatives were facing. How do you defend against specific documented accusations when responding might require discussing classified information? How do you maintain party unity when some of your most prominent members are suddenly dealing with credibility issues? The media response was intense and immediate. Cable news channels were running special coverage, political podcasts were releasing emergency episodes, and newspaper reporters were working around the clock to verify details and find additional sources. Everyone wanted to be the first to break new information about this developing story. What made everything worse for the Democrats involved was that their usual defenders in the media were struggling to help them. Liberal commentators who would normally rush to defend AOC and Crockett found themselves in the awkward position of not knowing exactly what had happened in those classified briefings. Without complete information, they couldn't mount effective defenses. Social media was absolutely brutal. The hashtags related to Patel's revelations were trending worldwide, and the responses were overwhelmingly negative for the representatives involved. Even some of their usual supporters were expressing disappointment and asking for explanations. The comment sections of their recent posts were filled with questions about the apparent contradictions between their public positions and their private actions. Political strategists from both parties were already analyzing the long-term implications of what had happened. This wasn't just a temporary controversy that would blow over in a few weeks. This was the kind of revelation that could permanently damage political careers and change how voters viewed certain politicians. The really scary part for Democratic leadership was that they didn't know if this was the end of Patel's revelations or just the beginning. If he had this much detailed information about intelligence briefings, What other secrets might he be willing to share? Were there other meetings, other documents, or other contradictions he could expose? As the hours passed after Patel's interview, it became clear that both Crockett and AOC were going to have to respond eventually. The story was too big and too specific to ignore, and their continued silence was only making them look more guilty. But crafting a response that addressed the serious questions without creating additional legal or political problems was proving to be nearly impossible. The panic in their offices was visible to anyone paying attention. Staff members were working. Late into the night, legal advisors were being consulted and crisis management experts were being brought in to help navigate the situation. This was exactly the kind of political nightmare that can end careers and destroy reputations. And everyone involved knew it. The days following Kash Patel's bombshell interview felt like watching a slow-motion political earthquake. What had started as a single television appearance was now reshaping the entire landscape of American politics, and the aftershocks were being felt everywhere from Capitol Hill to living rooms across the country. When Jasmine Crockett finally decided to break her silence, the response was everything her critics had hoped for and everything her supporters had feared. Standing behind a podium in a hastily arranged press conference, Crockett looked visibly uncomfortable as she tried to address the growing controversy without making things worse for herself. Her statement was carefully crafted by legal experts and political strategists, but it came across as exactly what it was: a defensive response from someone who had been caught in an impossible situation. She acknowledged that she had attended certain classified briefings as part of her congressional oversight duties, but she insisted that her public positions had always been consistent with her private beliefs. The problem was that nobody really believed her explanation. Political observers could see right through the carefully worded statements and legal language. If she had truly objected to the surveillance programs during those classified briefings, why hadn't she ever mentioned attending them? Why had she allowed people to believe she was opposing programs she had no inside knowledge of? Her attempts to clarify the situation only made things worse. Every time she tried to explain her position, she created new questions and contradictions. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was trying to have it both ways, taking credit for opposing surveillance programs while avoiding responsibility for having supported or failed to object to them in private. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez faced an even bigger challenge when she finally decided to respond. Her brand was built on authenticity and transparency, so her supporters expected her to be completely honest about what had happened. But the legal and political realities made that kind of honesty nearly impossible. When AOC finally posted her response on social media, it was clear that this wasn't the usual AOC everyone was used to seeing. Instead of her typical direct, conversational style, her statement read like it had been written by a committee of lawyers. She talked about the complexities of congressional oversight, the importance of classified briefings, and the need to balance transparency with national security. Her followers immediately noticed the difference. The comments on her posts were filled with people asking why she sounded so different, why she wasn't being more direct, and why she seemed to be avoiding the main questions that Patel had raised. Even her most loyal supporters were expressing confusion and disappointment. The really damaging part wasn't just the content of their responses. It was how defensive and evasive they sounded. Both Crockett and AOC had built their political careers on being straight shooters who told people the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Now they were giving the kind of carefully parsed, legally vetted responses that people associate with typical politicians who are trying to hide something. Polling data started coming in within days of their responses, and the numbers were devastating. Independent voters who had previously viewed both representatives favorably were now expressing serious doubts about their honesty and consistency. The gap between their public positions and their private actions was exactly the kind of hypocrisy that turns voters off from politics entirely. Conservative media was having an absolute field day with the situation. Talk radio hosts were playing clips of Crockett and AOC, criticizing surveillance programs right alongside excerpts from Patel's interview describing their participation in briefings about those same programs. The contrast was so stark that it didn't require any additional commentary. The hypocrisy spoke for itself. But the damage wasn't limited to conservative outlets. Mainstream media organizations were also struggling with how to cover the story. Many journalists who had previously been sympathetic to both representatives found themselves asking tough questions about the apparent contradictions in their positions. Late-night comedy shows, which had previously treated both politicians as heroes of the resistance, suddenly had new material that painted them in a much less flattering light. The jokes weren't just coming from conservative comedians anymore. Even liberal hosts were making fun of the awkward responses and obvious contradictions. The impact extended far beyond just these two representatives. Other Democratic politicians, who had taken similar public positions, were suddenly being asked whether they had attended classified briefings about surveillance programs. The entire party messaging around intelligence oversight was falling apart, as it became clear that some of their most vocal critics had actually been briefed on the programs they were criticizing. Republican strategists immediately recognized the political goldmine they had stumbled into. This wasn't just about two individual representatives. This was evidence of a broader pattern of Democratic hypocrisy on national security issues. They started planning how to use this information in upcoming elections and policy debates. The story began attracting international attention as well. Foreign media outlets picked up on the scandal, and America's allies started asking questions about the consistency of U.S. policy positions. If prominent American politicians were saying one thing in public while supporting different policies in private, how could other countries trust what they were being told in diplomatic meetings? Investigative journalists smelled blood in the water and started digging deeper into the story. They began filing Freedom of Information Act requests for documents related to the briefings Patel had described. They reached out to other former government officials who might be willing to provide additional information or context. Some of these follow-up investigations started uncovering additional details that made the situation even worse for the representatives involved. Documents showed that they hadn't just attended the briefings passively. They had asked questions, requested additional information, and in some cases had even suggested ways to expand or improve the programs they were publicly opposing. Credibility damage was spreading beyond just the specific issue of surveillance programs. Voters started questioning whether they could trust anything these representatives said about any topic. If they had been dishonest about something as important as intelligence oversight, what else might they be hiding or misrepresenting? Political donors who had previously supported both representatives started asking tough questions about where their money was going. Some major contributors pulled their support entirely, while others demanded meetings to discuss the contradictions between public positions and private actions. The situation got even more complicated when other sources started coming forward to corroborate different aspects of Patel's account. Former intelligence officials, congressional staff members, and government contractors began providing additional details about the briefings and the representatives' participation in them. Each new revelation made it harder for Crockett and AOC to maintain their explanations. What had started as a manageable political problem was turning into a full-blown credibility crisis that threatened to define their entire careers. The long-term political implications were becoming clear to everyone in Washington. This wasn't just a temporary controversy that would fade away after a few news cycles. The specific nature of Patel's revelations, combined with the documented evidence supporting his claims, had created permanent questions about the honesty and consistency of two of the Democratic Party's most prominent voices. Political science professors started using the situation as a case study in how quickly political careers can be derailed by revelations of hypocrisy. The contrast between public positions and private actions was so stark that it became a textbook example of why authenticity matters in politics. The broader impact on political discourse was also becoming apparent. Voters were becoming more skeptical of all politicians, wondering what other contradictions might be hiding beneath carefully crafted public positions. The revelation that even the most vocal critics of government programs might have been privately supportive of them was creating a deeper cynicism about the entire political system. As weeks passed, it became clear that both Crockett and AOC would never fully recover from the damage caused by Patel's revelations. Their influence within the Democratic Party was diminished, Their credibility with independent voters was destroyed, and their ability to effectively criticize government programs was permanently compromised. The story became a defining moment in contemporary American politics, demonstrating how a single well-timed revelation can expose the gap between public rhetoric and private reality. It showed that in the age of social media and constant scrutiny, political hypocrisy has consequences that can last for years and fundamentally change how the public views their elected representatives. Kash Patel's decision to go public with his knowledge had achieved exactly what he probably hoped it would. It had exposed what he saw as the dishonesty of politicians who built their careers on criticizing programs they had privately supported. The fallout would continue to influence American politics for years to come.